Dr. Roger Seaholt is a board-certified critical care physician
who breaks down complex science into clear, life-saving advice.
It was written by Russell Ryder, who is the executive editor of Melatonin Research. He's out of University of Texas. And Scott Zimmerman, who's a light engineer. And what they set forth was to show that basically sunlight is made up of so many different types of wavelengths. You've got ultraviolet on one end, which of course makes vitamin D. And it's very beneficial. It's the type of light from the sun that is very short wave, but cannot penetrate very deeply. Now, let me back up a little bit and explain. You pull up to a stop sign, and somebody pulls up next to you, and they're playing the latest hip hop music. How does that sound to you in your car? It's very boom, boom, right?
Yeah, muffled.
Okay. And muffled. And the reason why is because low wave frequency has the ability to travel very far. You go to the Grand Canyon, and there's a thunderstorm at the other end of it. What do you hear? It's like a rumbling. And then as it gets closer, you hear the higher pitched sounds. This is a fundamental physics principle. And so when the sun is shining, there's very short wavelengths, ultraviolet B, involved in vitamin D. But at the other end, there's this infrared light, which we'll talk about, or red light. It's very long wavelength, and it can penetrate very, very deeply. That's very important because what we're talking about is the human body. And if the sun is going to have an effect on the human body, it's got to be more than just the skin. So that's exactly what this paper showed, is that basically the infrared light from the sun is able to penetrate probably up to about 8 centimeters, according to Scott Zimmerman in this article. And it fundamentally interacts with specifically the mitochondria. And what does it do to the mitochondria? So let's back up and talk about the mitochondria, because this is central. The mitochondria to the cell is like the engine in your car. The engine produces locomotion that causes the wheels to spin, but in the process of doing it, it causes heat to surround the engine. And if you don't deal with that heat, it will shut down the engine. It will make it more inefficient, and eventually it will shut it down. So what do all internal combustion engines have? They have a cooling system. They have a radiator. They have an oil pan. They have a water pump. And that's exactly what the cell has to have for the mitochondria. It's not heat in the mitochondria. It's called oxidative stress. And it's specifically oxidative stress that causes destruction destruction of the mitochondria and leads to these types of diseases. So oxidative stress causes the mitochondria not to work well. This leads to diabetes. Oxidative stress makes the mitochondria not work so well. This leads to dementia. So this has already been laid out. This is not that controversial. The controversial part is, what do we do about it? So what these guys in this paper showed was that, and not just them, but reviewing the literature, is that the mitochondria makes its own cooling system. And that cooling system is melatonin. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, melatonin, isn't that the stuff that we take, that our brain makes right before we go to sleep? Yeah, it's absolutely correct. That's what happens. The problem is that this is not melatonin that's made in the brain. This is not melatonin that goes through the blood supply and goes through our blood and tells us it's time to go to sleep. This is melatonin that's made in the cell, in the mitochondria, and it's a powerful antioxidant that basically prevents the oxidative stress from occurring. What Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder showed and proposed in this was that basically the infrared radiation that's coming in to the body is able to stimulate and upregulate melatonin and a number of other factors that keep the mitochondria cool and can actually improve the energy output of the mitochondria. So this was actually mind-blowing to me. And I'll tell you why I resonated with this as a critical care physician. Because there was 2 things that bothered me the most. Number 1, SARS-CoV-2 virus. When it comes into the body, it interacts with something called the ACE2 receptor. You may have heard about the ACE2 receptor. Okay, this is where the virus actually latches on to the cell and gets internalized. So what is this ACE2 receptor? Was this there for all of humanity just to be a receptor, or does it actually have a role? It turns out it actually has a role, and mind-blowingly, the ACE2 receptor is involved in mitigating oxidative stress. So in other words, it's another part of the cell's cooling system for the mitochondria. What what's happening is that the virus, when it attaches to the cell, is basically eliminating that action. And so imagine you have a bunch of people with various different engines running at different temperatures. In other words, you've got some people with chronic disease, and we know their engines are running hot. We have other people who are completely healthy, and they're doing quite well. Their engines are nice and cool. They have no problems at all. Now imagine COVID comes, and SARS-CoV-2 is infecting everybody. What that tendency is to do is, because it's knocking out everybody's ACE2 receptor, which has the ability to cool down the engine, in other words, it's causing everybody's engine to run hot, right? So in other words, picture is this way: you're driving along in your car, and your thermometer is there, and all of a sudden there's this big hill that you have to climb called COVID-19. Who's going to make it over that hill, and who's not going to make it over that hill? The people that make it over the hill are those with great cooling engines whose temperatures are running great. The ones that don't make it over that hill are the ones that have the thermometer on their engine running hot. Those are the ones that poop out at the top and can't make it. And they're the ones pulled over to the side of the road with the hood up and the steam coming out of the engine. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Of course, yeah.
So this makes perfect sense to me why I wasn't seeing what they were predicting, which is these respiratory patients coming into the ICU. Who was I seeing in the ICU? I was seeing people with dementia, as we talked about, diabetes, kidney disease. These are the ones that were sick. The other thing that really hit me and resonated with this was, and this was not even controversial. We knew early on in the pandemic that people who came into the hospital and had higher levels of vitamin D did really well. They didn't die. They didn't have the same chances of dying. People who had low vitamin D levels, they had much higher levels, chances of dying. So we would check these vitamin D levels. And so think about this. You're there at ground zero, and you're taking care of these patients, and you see this data over and over and over again, that vitamin D is very predictive of who's going to die. Obviously, what are you going to do? Even though this is an associative study, that association doesn't mean causation, you're going to be giving people vitamin D and try to get those levels up. The problem is that we gave vitamin D, and it really didn't have much of an effect. So
you gave it in supplement tablet form?
When people would come into the hospital.
Like this?
Exactly, just like that. In fact, I was supplementing myself. I mean, what have you got to lose, right? I already took my vitamin D tablet this morning. That's very hard to overdose, but it's possible.
So you noticed that it was hard to treat people with vitamin D, but giving them a tablet didn't really do much.
That's correct.
Why?
Well, this is what I believe is the fact, is we saw that people with high levels of vitamin D or normal levels of vitamin D did better than those that had low levels. I believe that was a marker of something else. In other words, people who had higher levels of vitamin D meant that they were out in the sun more. They were outside more than the people that had very low vitamin D levels. The people with low vitamin D levels were telling me these are people that were not getting outside into the sun. And so what's the real factor here? What's doing the heavy lifting? And I would propose, and Scott Zimmerman and Russell Ryder would propose, and I can tell you a number of other scientists that would agree with me on this, is that infrared radiation from the sun is causing an effect at the mitochondrial level in terms of oxidative stress, and that vitamin D was just the marker of who was getting the infrared light and who was not, who was going outside and who was not going outside. So when the sun is shining, for the most part, you're getting infrared light, you're getting the entire biological spectrum from the sun. We can go to the longest wavelength, which is far infrared, all the way to the shortest wavelength, which is ultraviolet B, okay, which makes vitamin D. So in other words, when you are outside in a natural environment, you're getting a very broad spectrum of light. And so because of that, if you're getting infrared light, you're also going to be making vitamin D.
Yeah.
You're getting both. Now, that can change because in the wintertime, when the sun is lower in the sky, especially in England, this is a special issue at that latitude. When the sun is low in the sky, the light has to penetrate obliquely through the atmosphere. And because of that, shortwave radiation from the sun, like ultraviolet B, does not make it very well. So there's times of the year where you're not getting enough ultraviolet B, or maybe even no ultraviolet B from the sun.
Which makes the vitamin D.
Which makes the vitamin D, and that you're going to be deficient. You need to supplement. However, during that same period of time, when you're not getting enough vitamin D because there's no ultraviolet B radiation, that sun is low, but it's still enough to allow that long wavelength penetrating infrared light to still come through.
So is the long wave infrared light the type of thing that we see these gadgets doing?
Absolutely. And I would say, just to be specific, is because you can see that as red light there, that's not infrared light because you can see it. So infrared light technically is completely invisible.
But these do give out infrared light, but you just can't see it.
Exactly. So it's toward that red end of the spectrum. And people like Glenn Jeffrey out of UCL is actually doing research at 670 nanometers of red light and has shown in randomized controlled trials that type of light right there at 670, the type that you can even see, actually does improve mitochondrial efficiency. He's shown this in a number of randomized controlled trials. It improves eyesight, and you have to realize that the retina at the back of your eye is very rich in mitochondria. He's shown this in terms of managing glucose and output from mitochondria. And the reason why these things work so well is because what's going on here is as you get older, your skin starts to become more saggy because the fibroblasts, or the cells in your skin, they're designed to make collagen. And collagen is the skeleton that makes your skin soft and supple. Yeah.
Don't mind me, please carry on.
No. So this is exactly it. My wife uses the same thing.
This is a bond charge one.
So what's going on right now is that red light, which can penetrate very deeply down, is going into the skin, and it is activating the mitochondria in your fibroblasts to produce more energy, which those cells need to deposit collagen. And so when you deposit collagen, that's going to give the skin a more tight feel, because as you get older, that collagen deposition is going to get less and less and less.
So this is going to help keep me looking young?
That's the whole point of it.
And you're saying that the light in these penetrates, what, 6 or 7 centimeters? Or is it?
Infrared does about 8 centimeters. This red light would be a little bit less because this light, obviously you can see it, so it is a little bit shorter wavelength. But yes, this light, the red light, can penetrate deeper than, for instance, yellow light or blue light. And it's this light particularly that interacts with the mitochondria to increase that.
So should we be putting this all over our body? Because, okay, it's good for my skin, but if it's penetrating deeper, presumably there's other parts of my body that would benefit from that, and other mitochondria.
It's interesting you say that. The study that I'm referring to with Glenn Jeffrey out of University College London, he took young people in this study. He gave them a bunch of glucose. And everybody who gets a bunch of glucose should have a spike in their blood sugar. He randomized them on their backs to see what would happen when he shined red light on their backs. And the people that got the red light had lower spikes. In other words, it seemed as though the mitochondria were metabolizing faster, which caused less of a spike of the glucose in their blood. The way he confirmed that is looking for the byproducts of the mitochondrial metabolism, which is carbon dioxide. So when we breathe, when we metabolize, we're breathing out carbon dioxide, which is the result of a mitochondrial metabolism. And in fact, in those people that had the light on, it showed a higher level of carbon dioxide in the exhaled breath. The whole point of that is to get back to your question, is whether we should be putting this all over your body. He was able to get that effect systemically with just putting the light on the back. That was a systemic ability. We don't understand everything about the mitochondria, but what we do seem to understand is that they can communicate with each other, and that you don't need to have this all over the body to have systemic effects. In this particular case, though, if you want to have the skin here to be more, younger looking, then it makes sense that this is where you need to have it. If you want to have a particular other part of your body to look younger, then perhaps that's where the light needs to go.
So interesting. So how long did it take in those studies to see the effect of red light therapy like this?
Well, that's a very good question. If you talk to Glenn Jeffrey, which I have, he noticed an improvement in 15 minutes. 15 minutes.
What did he notice in 15 minutes?
He said he has studied the mitochondria in fruit flies, in mosquitoes and bees and in human beings, and it's the same every time. He says after about 15 to 20 minutes of this type of light in that type of setting, there is a switch that turns on, and you don't need further stimulation. Further stimulation doesn't do anything more. It's a very bizarre thing. You would think that the more light that you gave, the more the effect would be. It's not. After about 15 minutes, there's something that changes in the mitochondria. There are certain theories about where this might be. This might be in the electron transport chain, complex 4. These are very technical things. There's a lot of studies that are actually, there's a number of groups that are actually looking at this. There's a whole area of science called photobiomodulation, which is looking at this. But 15 minutes is really what it takes. So we're not talking about a long period of time. This is really interesting. So getting back to my experience in the intensive care unit, the vitamin D wasn't working. These patients were dying, and it became clear to me that COVID was a metabolic issue for these patients. By the time I had realized this, the pandemic arguably is still going on because people are still becoming infected, but the rush to come into the hospital and the number of bodies that we were seeing circulating through the intensive care unit had dropped dramatically. And at that point, I was able to see that potentially infrared light may be very, very beneficial in these patients with COVID-19. Now, there was a study in Brazil. They took COVID patients that were sick enough to be admitted to the hospital, but not too sick to be intubated in an intensive care unit. And they did something tremendous. They actually manufactured a jacket that they could put on patients. And on the inside of this jacket were these LED bulbs that gave off infrared radiation at exactly 940 nanometers. They put the jackets on, and they randomized the sign which jacket was turned on and which jacket was turned off. It was blinded because the light coming from this jacket could not be seen by the human eye. It wasn't even enough to produce enough heat. And so they did this on 30 subjects, and they randomized them. 15 did it. All 30 had the jackets on. 15 had it turned on. 15 did not have it turned on. And they watched them. What happens to these patients? Every single endpoint that they looked at was statistically significant. And
what does that mean?
It means that the differences between these two groups could not have been from chance. There was a real difference. The group that had the jacket turned on had improvement in their oxygen saturation, could take breaths in more deeply and stronger, had improvements in their white blood cells, and not only that, had improvements in their heart rate, their respiratory rate, all of these statistically significant. But the most important and mind-blowing statistic was the length of stay in the hospital. So they had these jackets on for 15 minutes once a day for 7 days. In the group that did not have the jacket turned on, their average length of stay was 12 days in the hospital. For those that had the jacket turned on, it was 8 days. That was 4-day difference. That's tremendous when you realize that it costs thousands of dollars to hospitalize patients. It's a huge amount when you think about the fact that there are certain drugs that get FDA approved for influenza, for instance, by just cutting short the symptoms for 24 hours. This is not just 24 hours, 40. People were discharged from the hospital 4 days faster. When I saw that study, that was enough for me to convince me. I mean, obviously it was 30 subjects, right? We should do a bigger study. We should do a couple hundred, right? That would be ideal to do. But the fact that with just 30 patients, they could show statistical significance, that was enough for me to say every patient from now on that I see that comes in with COVID-19 that's hospitalized, that they're asking me to go intubate, to bring to my ICU, these patients are gonna get outside. I don't have that jacket that they made in Brazil. I don't even know how I would make that jacket. They made it for the study. And it's not commercially available. There's no 940 nanometer light, which is what they did in the study. But I do know this. I do know that sunlight has 940 nanometers in it. And if I could just take these patients outside, maybe they could improve. So I got my wish. I had a patient on the floor. He was on 35 liters a minute, 100% oxygen, through his high flow.
Through his nose?
Through his nose.
Why?
Barely saturating because he had COVID-19. And I was asked to go see him because he was potentially needing to be intubated or brought to the intensive care unit. I could not believe it because I had not seen one of these in months. So I went down, walked into the room, opened the door. It was in isolation. I had a mask on, the whole 9 yards. The room was completely dark. The blind was closed. His daughter was there. And the first words out of his mouth to me was, "Doc, how much time have I got?" I mean, it was a catastrophe. Like, there was no light, no circadian rhythm. This guy was depressed. I immediately called my respiratory therapist, immediately called the charge nurse. We got everybody together, and I said, we need to get this guy outside. It was a bright and sunny day. How are we going to get this guy outside? 35 liters, 100%. My respiratory therapist, Kim, managed to put a couple of oxygen tanks together, and we were able to get this guy into a wheelchair, and we wheeled him outside. And he told me this weeks later, but he says, you know, that first day that you got me outside in the sun, because we did this for like 7 days in a row, he said, that felt so good. He, after just one day, dropped down from 35 liters to 15 liters.
15 liters of
oxygen, and then down to 12, and then down to 8 the next day, and then down to 5. 5 days.
The amount of oxygen he was inhaling to keep him alive.
Correct. So in other words, we were titrating down the amount of oxygen that we had to give him to maintain a saturation in the 90s. In 5 days, he was discharged home without oxygen. Now, obviously, that's an anecdote, right? That's not a study. But I'm looking at the risks of getting people out in the sun for 15, 20 minutes. There's not a lot of risk to that. And if there's a benefit, I thought it was worthwhile doing. We need to have larger randomized controlled trials. But it got me down the road to looking to see what was it about sunlight that was affecting this change. And you know what? There's ample data. There was a study actually that was done in Europe where they said, okay, here's COVID. COVID's going up. When does COVID go up? Is it because of temperature that changes? Is it because of humidity? And the answers to both of those were no. Do you know what predicted when countries were to have their first surge in the autumn of 2020? There was a study that was actually done on this. It was latitude. It started in Finland and then went down the entire continent. The last country in the autumn of 2020 to have a COVID surge was Greece. So as the sun is literally pulling down into the southern hemisphere, as the shadow starts to go over Europe, that's when we start to see COVID surges, one by one by one. Is
that because COVID and the sun aren't friends? So it makes it harder to spread because, you know, if I put COVID on this table and then I put sunlight on the table, the COVID is going to die.
Yeah, it's possible. Although we now know that COVID probably doesn't spread too much through contact. It's more of an airborne thing. So there was a study that was done at the University of Edinburgh, and they looked at this very question that we had talked about earlier about vitamin D. They looked at the United States in the wintertime. And they eliminated the southern part of the United States because in the southern part of the United States, you can actually get some vitamin D in the wintertime. So they just looked at the northern portion of the United States, and they were able to show that the more sunlight there was in particular areas, the lower the mortality from COVID-19. So they said, this is interesting. What about in England? So they did the exact same study in England, and sure enough, of course, they didn't have to eliminate any part of England because the whole country doesn't get any vitamin D in the wintertime. What they showed was that, again, certain parts of the country in England, as you know, get more sunlight than other parts. Well, those areas that got more sunlight had lower mortality from COVID-19. Then they took they predicated the same study, and they looked in Italy. Exactly the same finding, and they published this. And they said in their study, and this is what really amazed me, they said, if this is causal, they said that this might actually show a possible public health intervention. The fact that it is completely independent of vitamin D means that there's something else going on.
There was a study in 2011 in Sweden.
Yes.
Is that linked to this?
No, this is a completely different study, but that's also a very important study. So the Swedish study is groundbreaking. This was a study where they asked 20 to 30,000 Swedish women about their habits in sunlight. And they divided these women into 3 categories. Those women that did not get a lot of sun, those that got a moderate amount of sun, and those that got a lot of sun. And they followed them for 20 years. And they kept a track of each one that died and what they died of. And when they were done with that, they were astonished because what they found was that the women who had spent the large amount of their time outside, or spent the most amount of time outside, had the least amount of mortality from cancer, from cardiovascular disease, and non-cardiovascular disease. And those that spent the least amount of time outside had the highest levels of that. The magnitude difference between those two was so much that they were able to show that women who, in Sweden, who spent the most amount of time outside and smoked had the same mortality as those women that did not spend as much time outside and did not smoke.
They were equal.
They were equal. In other words, being in that category of not spending much time outside in the sun was the same risk factor for death as smoking.
How do they know it wasn't linked to exercise? How are they able to establish causation? Because that's
that's an excellent question. So the difference here as you go up is this is an association study. Okay, so the question is how can you get causation from association? You can't. But if you look at the Bradford Hill criteria, there is a way that you can potentially make a strong argument for causation if there's something called a dose-response curve. In other words, if you can show, you're not just comparing 2 things, but you're comparing 3 or more, if you can show that as you increase the variable, that there is a change in the outputs, that is strongly suggestive of potentially causation. By the way, this is exactly what we did to show that smoking causes lung cancer. Obviously, we can't do a randomized control trial. Here, you get to smoke, you don't get to smoke. We'll follow up in 20 years to see who has lung cancer. This is exactly what we did. We showed that there was such a strong association with cancer risk with smoking that we were able to say, through association, that smoking causes lung cancer. By the way, Richard Weller, who's a dermatologist in England, did just last year a very similar study as to the Swedish study, except it was 10 times bigger, and he did it with both men and women. He found the same results. It was a UK Biobank study.
What did he discover?
He discovered that either from solariums or or being outside using solar radiation data, he was able to show both on their questionnaire and also where they lived, that the more light that they had, the lower their risk of mortality and cancer mortality. So the question was, does it increase melanoma?
What's melanoma?
Melanoma is a skin cancer. So that's the big risk. That's the big risk that everybody's concerned about. You go out into the sun and you're going to get skin cancer. And he was able to show in that study, this was like 400,000 people in this study, UK Biobank study, Richard Weller. He was able to show that there's no statistical increased risk of melanoma incidence, but there was a reduction in non-skin cancer mortality. Okay, so here's the trade-off. If you want to go out into the sun in England, okay, the benefits are you're going to have a reduction in non-skin cancer mortality.
So everything other than skin cancer?
Correct. On the other hand, there's no increase in melanoma incidence. So that caused him to write an op-ed and publish it. And actually, you can look up this op-ed. It's a great op-ed. Published in in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology called Sunlight, Time for a Rethink, where he goes through the arguments. And he's actually shown, and there's been a number of changes that people are making around the globe. So public health organizations that are saying now, before we have said that, the sun is a deadly laser and you should avoid it at all costs. We may need to rethink that.
So are you telling me that essentially 15 minutes in the sun every day turns on a switch in my body that improves my mitochondrial function, which is going to impact a variety of different parts of my health? Is that essentially what you're saying?
Essentially, yes. And we're looking, and this is in an environment where we are spending less and less and less time. To put it in perspective, if we were on a British ship 300 years ago, and I came to you and I said, do you see this little yellow fruit? Just by eating a little bit of this yellow fruit, all of this disease that you're seeing around you with your fellow shipmates is going to go away. That would seem almost incredulous, right? Mm-hmm. But that's exactly the case. We are, the scurvy of the 21st century is the lack of sunlight. Everything is inside. We avoid the outside. We avoid discomfort. We avoid high temperatures. We avoid low temperatures. We used to go out and play sports. We now are playing virtual sports on pads. We have windows that are specifically designed, especially here in Southern California, to eliminate infrared light. Because why? Infrared light comes in and it heats up. One of the interesting things, we didn't mention this about infrared light, is the way that we interact with infrared light. You can tell this on your own. You go outside and close your eyes. You can tell which side of your body the sun is on. And the reason is because that infrared light not only can penetrate through your body, it's also penetrating through clothes very easily. And you can feel that heat that you're feeling is the infrared light going through the clothes, going through the skin, and interacting with your heat receptors that are well below the surface. So all of this,